Elias Vorn had never done anything remarkable in his life. He was 23 years old, lived in a small village tucked between two mountains, and spent most of his days carrying stone, mending fences, and drinking bad coffee at his grandmother's kitchen table. He was the kind of young man people looked past without meaning to, not because there was anything wrong with him, but because nothing about him announced itself. He was quiet, he was ordinary. And for a long time, he believed that was simply what he was. The village had no proper name on any modern map. The people who lived there called it Vorn, after the family that had settled it 300 years ago and never quite left. It was the sort of place where old women kept dried herbs tied above their doorways, and old men refused to walk the hill road after dark. Nobody explained why. It was simply understood. Some knowledge passes through generations not as words but as feeling, a tightening in the stomach when certain places are near, a habit of looking away from certain stones. Elias had grown up with all of it and believed none of it. He was practical by nature. When his grandmother, Mira, told him that the ruins on the hill were older than the village and should not be disturbed, he nodded politely and thought she was being sentimental. When the older farmers refused to graze their animals near the northern slope, he assumed it was superstition. He was wrong about both things. He would understand that soon enough. It started with a dream. He was in his bed on a cold Tuesday night in October when he heard the voice. It came from somewhere beneath the world, not from outside the window, not from the walls, but from somewhere below the floor, below the earth itself, as though the ground had learned to speak. The voice was deep and slow and patient, the way a river is patient, the way stone is patient. It did not shout, it did not beg, it simply said, "There is one who can hear me. Has he the courage to come?" Elias woke up with his heart hammering and his breath sharp in the cold air. He lay still for a long time, looking at the ceiling. Then he went back to sleep and told himself it was nothing. But it came again the next night, and the night after that. On the third morning, he came downstairs to find his grandmother watching him from across the kitchen table, with the particular stillness she reserved for serious things. Mira was 81 years old and had the kind of face that looked like it had already seen everything and was no longer surprised. She poured him coffee, sat down, and said, "You heard him, didn't you?" It was not a question. Elias set down his cup. "Who is him?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees on the hill, and the sound it made was low and old. Then she told him. 300 years ago, she said, when the village was young and the world beyond it was different, in ways difficult now to explain, there existed a line of men, unlike ordinary men. They were called the wolf blood, not wolves themselves, but something older, something that stood at the edge between the human world and what lay beyond it. They were protectors. They kept the dark things away from the settlements in the valleys and the farms on the hillsides. People knew they existed the way people know that deep water exists. As a fact, they preferred not to think about too carefully. The last of them was a king. His name was Kael Sundvaar, and he was the most powerful of his line. He ruled not with cruelty, but with absolute authority, and everything that hunted in the dark understood this and kept its distance. For decades, the region was safe. Children grew up without fear. Harvests were good. The name Kael Sundvaar was spoken with the kind of quiet gratitude that does not announce itself. But power makes people nervous. Even power that protects. A council of 7 sorcerers, men who dealt in binding and sealing, and the careful management of things they considered too dangerous to exist freely, decided that the Alpha King had become too strong. They could not control him. They could not predict him. And so, in the autumn of 1724, they gathered on the hill above the village, with 7 years' worth of prepared seals, and spoke the words that had taken them a decade to learn. They bound Kael Sundvaar into the bedrock itself, alive, conscious, and unable to move or speak to any living soul. The stone closed over him like water over a stone. The sorcerers left. The village survived, and for 300 years the ruins on the hill held their secret, while the world above them changed, and changed, and changed again. Mira finished her coffee and looked at her grandson. "Others have gone up that hill," she said. "Over the years, some came back strange, some did not come back at all." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Promise me, you will not go." Elias promised her. He meant it. in the way that people mean things before they fully understand what they are choosing. He went anyway. 2 nights later, he could not explain why, except that the voice had returned every night since his grandmother spoke, and something in him, something that lived deeper than reason, recognized it. Not with fear, with a feeling he had no good word for. Like hearing a sound that has been in the background of every room you have ever stood in, so constant you stop noticing it, and then suddenly, it stops, and the silence it leaves behind is the loudest thing you have ever heard. He climbed the hill in the dark with a lantern, and no particular plan. The ruins were exactly as they had always appeared from a distance: crumbling stone, old archways, patches of moss over everything. But close up, in the lantern light, there was something else. A quality of age that was different from ordinary old things. Buildings can be ancient and still feel empty. These stones did not feel empty. They felt like a held breath. He found the chamber at the lowest point of the ruins, half buried under a century of fallen soil. He had to crouch to enter it. When he did, the lantern light fell across the floor, and he saw the seal. It was a flat expanse of dark stone, roughly 3 meters across, covered in markings he could not read. They were not glowing, not blazing with any obvious power. They were simply present in a way that went beyond the visual, the way certain pieces of music are present, pressing against something inside you that has no name. Elias knelt down without deciding to. He placed his palm flat against the stone. The world went white. He was standing in a vast and empty place with no sky and no floor, only whiteness in every direction for as far as he could see. And standing before him, 10 feet away, was a man. He was enormous, not in the way that oversized men are enormous, but in the way that cliffs are enormous. Something about his presence took up more room than his body occupied. He wore clothes from another century, dark and plain, and his hair was silver white, and his eyes were the color of amber, and he was looking at Elias with an expression that was impossible to read. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a very long time. Then the man said, "You are not what I expected." Elias, who had nothing to lose by being honest, replied, "I am not what anyone expects." Something shifted in the man's face. It was small, barely a change at all, but it was there. He had been alone for 300 years. He had spoken to no living person in 3 centuries, and the first words spoken to him in all of that time were so simple and so plain that they reached him in a way that any great declaration of bravery could not have. His name was Kael. Elias understood this without being told, the same way he had understood the voice in his dreams. Kael explained what the seal was and how it worked, slowly and clearly, as though he had been preparing the explanation for a long time, which he had. The seal could not be broken by the bloodline of the sorcerers who built it. They had ensured their own descendants would have no key to undo their work. But they had included one clause, written in the deep grammar of binding magic, which they believed would never matter. If a person with no agenda, no inheritance, and no fear touched the seal with complete sincerity of intention, the process of release could begin. Elias had done this, without knowing, without trying, but the seal was not yet broken. To complete the release, Kael explained, Elias needed to return for 3 consecutive nights and speak his true name aloud, his full name, the name given to him at his naming ceremony 3 centuries ago, which carried the weight of his entire identity. Kael could not say it himself. The seal prevented that. Elias would have to find it on his own. He returned to the village and began to look. There was almost nothing written about Kael Sundvaar in any record Elias could find. The sorcerers had done a thorough job of erasing him. He found a passing reference in a handwritten ledger at the back of the village's tiny church, and a single word carved into a stone that looked different from the others. Older, more deliberate, but no name. What he found instead was Brother Aldrich. Aldrich was a traveling monk who came through the village once a year, always in October, always on his way to and from the mountain parishes to the north. He was a small, thoughtful man who drank too much tea and read too much and asked careful questions. When Elias showed him the sigil he had sketched from the seal, Aldrich set down his cup and did not pick it up again for a long time. He knew the sigil. He knew what it meant. He knew, because he was a descendant of one of the 7 sorcerers, the youngest of the bloodline, the most reluctant, the one who had spent 40 years in the church partly out of genuine faith, and partly out of penance for what his ancestor had done. He knew Kael's true name. He had been told, very clearly, never to speak it. He spoke it anyway. He told Elias. The name was Kael Sundvaar. In the old tongue of the wolf bloodline, it meant the one who holds the line. That same evening, 3 strangers arrived in the village. They came in a black car that was too clean for mountain roads, and wore clothes that fit too well. They had eyes that moved in the careful, measuring way of people who are always assessing. They asked questions at the inn about the ruins on the hill. They were polite, in the manner of people who have never needed to be threatening because they have never been challenged. These were the council's inheritors, the current guardians of the seal, the living continuation of the sorcerer's intent. Someone had triggered the first stage of the release. They knew. They had come to stop it. On the second night, Elias returned to the ruins despite everything. Inside the white space, Kael was different, slightly more present, slightly more solid, as though the first night's contact had already loosened something in the seal. They spoke for a long time, not about the magic, not about the plan, about ordinary things. Kael asked what the world was like now. Elias told him, haltingly, realizing as he spoke how difficult it is to explain cars to someone who last saw horses, or cities to someone who last saw village fires at night. Kael listened to every stumbling word with total attention. He had not had a conversation in 300 years. He was not about to rush through one. When Elias finally said, "I know your name," Kael went very still. "Then say it," Kael said quietly. Elias said, "Kael Sundvaar." The white space shook. Not violently, more like a shudder, the way a structure shifts when a weight is lifted from one end. Cracks appeared in the nothingness, fine as spider silk, running out from a central point in every direction. They were not open yet, but they were there. He came down from the hill to find his grandmother awake at the kitchen table, her coat already on. She had seen the 3 strangers at the inn. She had understood immediately who they were. She told him she would handle them the following evening. He should not ask how. She said this with the same calm certainty she used when she said the bread was done, or the weather was about to turn. Mira had always been more than she appeared. Elias had simply never known how much more. He went on the 3rd night. The youngest of the 3 strangers was already in the chamber when Elias arrived. He was not old, perhaps 30, perhaps younger, and whatever patience the others had developed over their years of guardianship, he had not yet learned. He stepped in front of the seal and told Elias to leave. His voice was steady, his hands were not. Elias looked at him for a moment. Then he knelt down. The stranger moved toward him. The seal flared cold blue. Not fire, not heat, but a cold light that came from below the stone and lit the whole chamber. Elias placed his palm flat on the surface. He could feel it under his hand, vibrating, waiting. He did not fight. He did not argue. He simply made his choice with his whole self, quietly, the way he did everything, and he spoke the name for the last time. Kael Sundvaar. "I see you. You may come home." The seal did not break like glass. It dissolved. The sigils faded one by one, like embers going out, each taking a small piece of the binding with it. The stone became stone again, just stone, cold and ordinary and old. And then there was a presence in the chamber that had not been there before. The air changed, the temperature changed. The stranger took one step back, then another, then turned and ran. Kael stood in the chamber. He was real, fully real, present in the world in a way he had not been in 300 years. He was exactly as he had appeared in the white space, except that here, he looked slightly lost, the way anyone looks when they step out of a long darkness into ordinary light. He stood still for a moment, breathing slowly, looking at his own hands, as though making sure they were his. Then he looked at Elias. Elias, who was still kneeling on the floor of a cold, ruined chamber in the middle of the night, looked back up at him and said, "Hello." Kael's expression was something Elias had no word for. It was relief and grief and something that was almost wonder. He had expected to be freed by power, perhaps, by some great effort of will, or by someone with magic in their blood. He had not expected this. A young man with dirty knees and tired eyes who simply came when called and asked for nothing in return. "Why?" Kael asked. His voice was as Elias remembered it from the dreams. Deep, slow, patient. Elias thought about it honestly. "You were calling," he said. It seemed wrong not to come. The three strangers left the village the next morning. They did not come back. Kael did not disappear into legend after he was freed. He sat at Mira's kitchen table on the first morning and drank coffee, badly, because he had no idea what coffee was, and looked out the window at the village with an expression of careful attention, as though cataloging every detail of a world that had changed entirely without him. Mira sat across from him and spoke quietly in a language Elias could not understand. They talked for a long time. When it was over, Mira cried once, briefly, and Kael placed his hand on her shoulder with the gentleness of someone who understood exactly what 300 years of carrying a secret costs a person. Elias made more coffee and did not ask what they had said. Some conversations are not for everyone. In the days that followed, Kael moved through the modern world with the careful attention of a man who is too intelligent to pretend he understands things he does not. He asked questions constantly, about everything, about cars and electric light and the shape of maps, and why people looked at small glass screens all day. Elias answered as best he could, which was imperfectly, which seemed to satisfy Kael more than a perfect answer would have. He was formidable. Elias had understood that in the white space, but out in the world it was more obvious. There was a quality to Kael's presence that made rooms feel different when he entered them, that made people go quiet without knowing why. He did not use this deliberately. It was simply what he was. But he was also a man who had been alone for 300 years and was only now learning what it felt like to not be. One evening, about a week after the ceiling was broken, they sat on the hill above the ruins together and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. Kael had been unusually quiet all day, not the heavy silence of unhappiness, but the contemplative silence of someone sorting through thoughts too large and too many to organize quickly. Eventually he said, "I do not know what I am in this world. Everything I was built to protect, it is all different now. The things I kept away have mostly faded on their own. The people I swore to serve are 300 years dead. I do not know what my purpose is." He said this without self-pity. He said it the way a practical man states a problem that needs solving. Elias sat with it for a moment. Then he said, "Neither do I. I have never known what my purpose is. I spent 23 years feeling like I was standing in the wrong place." Kael looked at him. "Maybe," Elias said. "That is something we can figure out together. We have time." The wind came down off the mountain and moved through the grass on the hillside. The ruins below them were quiet and empty, and finally, after all their long years, ordinary. The seal was gone. The stone was just stone. The hill was just a hill. Kael looked out at the valley below, at the lights of the village coming on, one by one, as the dark came in. A small, quiet thing moved through his face. Not quite a smile, but something near the place where smiles begin. 300 years, he said softly, and the one who came for me was a common boy with no agenda and dirty knees. "I cleaned my knees," Elias said. Kael was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, you did." And that, as it turned out, was enough.